Good morning, everyone. My name is John Stanford, and I am co-executive director of Small Business Roundtable. Thanks for joining us for this event that starts at 10 a.m. Eastern on Wednesday, December 1st. We will kick this off in just a couple minutes as we let attendees show up to the event. Really excited for the panel we have today, as well as some of the guest members of Congress for an important conversation on the impact of broadband in small business. So we'll be getting started in just a minute as we let more attendees into the room. Thanks everyone for joining us today. All right. Well, we seem to have a lot of interest in this issue, and it looks like we've got a lot of folks already in. So we will go ahead and start today's important conversation. As I mentioned, my name is John Stanford. I'm the co-executive director of Small Business Roundtable. Small Business Roundtable is the largest coalition of small business leaders in the country. We collectively bring together the CEOs of the major small business organizations and diversity chambers to unite the small business community around issues that are critically important in Washington and state capitals around the country. I think one of those issues that's critically important is what we're focused on here today. And that's the role of broadband. And I think we can, for today's conversation, talk about broadband in a broad way and the importance that getting all entrepreneurs and the opportunity of entrepreneurship is realized through access to high-speed internet in the 21st century. Over the last 2 years, we have seen what many are calling the Great Pivot. Small Business Roundtable did a number of research and reports that will circulate to attendees that showed that how small businesses responded to the coronavirus pandemic was in many ways by going online and finding ways to ensure that their business could still reach customers and consumers through digital means. That great pivot was only enabled by access to high speed and quality internet. And for many business owners, that was a blessing, but for far too many, they were left behind because they failed to have access to high quality internet. And that's something we'll be talking about today, is the promise and potential of that broadband, but also ensuring that it is equitable opportunity for all. A number of you worked closely on the infrastructure package that was recently enacted. We're going to talk about that, how that'll make some meaningful steps. But that bill into itself will not solve some of the challenges faced by small business owners, as you're going to hear from our incredible panel today. But before we get to them, I want to kick it over for some remarks from Representative Angie Craig, who was kind enough to join us to talk about this issue. So we'll play her remarks here.
Hi, I'm Angie Craig, and I'm so proud to represent Minnesota's 2nd Congressional District in the United States Congress. I'm sorry that I can't join you in person today, but I'm so grateful to the Small Business Roundtable for giving me an opportunity to join you via video with brief remarks. I care deeply about small businesses across my congressional district and across this country. There is no doubt that a lack of access to broadband internet is holding rural communities in Minnesota back. Access to reliable, high-speed internet is critical for success in the 21st century. That's why I'm so proud that the infrastructure investment we made in the bipartisan infrastructure bill is finally going to invest $65 billion in broadband across our nation. Right now, many of the communities that I represent in Congress simply don't have the high quality internet access they need to thrive and grow. And until they do, they will be competing on an unlevel playing field. I refuse to allow my constituents, especially those in rural communities, to be left behind because of the federal government's failure to provide them with the tools they need and the investments that they deserve. As a member of the House Task Force on Rural Broadband, I'm fully committed to the goal of bringing high-speed internet to every American by 2025, because broadband isn't a luxury. It's the infrastructure of the 21st century. Expanding access will create economic opportunity for thousands of hardworking Minnesotans and millions of Americans across our nation. Thanks for all that you do to make this dream a reality, and I look forward to working with you on this critical priority in the months and years to come.
Well, thanks as always to Congresswoman Craig, certainly someone whose district would be familiar with the issues we're going to talk about today. A quick overview of the rest of this event. We're looking forward to Congressman Troy Carter joining us live here shortly to give some remarks as well about what this will mean down in Louisiana. But we're also really thrilled about the panel that we've brought together. Mike O'Reilly, former FCC commissioner, who hardly needs any introduction, is really going to be able to share the nuts and bolts of this. And as we talk about broadband and its potential benefit for small businesses, I think so many of us know that this is an important topic. But then as we peel back the onion, we're not sure about how this will actually take place. And you heard Congresswoman Craig mention $65 billion for broadband. How is that going to manifest itself in these communities? So really glad Mike was able to join us today. John Breaux from the National Consumers League has overseen the telecommunications conversation, really bringing that perspective of equity for consumers and a lot of insights on the small business front. Also excited that Karen Kerrigan, President and CEO of the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council, who's been a long-standing champion of broadband, and a lot of credit to SBE Council for securing important victories in that infrastructure package. Unfortunately, Connie Evans from the Association for Enterprise Opportunity is no longer able to join us today, but you can learn more about AEO and the impact of broadband on microbusiness at aeoworks.org. So we're going to have a robust conversation, and let's jump right into it. And we'll kick off the panel as we wait. We know that Congressman Carter will be joining us here shortly, but we'll go ahead and get started. And Mike, I want to kick off this with you, your experience, not just as the FCC commissioner, but also, the work you're doing now in communities. Can you do some level setting? Where does America stand right now as it relates to broadband? And, what are some of the moving pieces associated with getting broadband to small business owners everywhere?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I won't go through the history of the technology, those in dial-up or DSL, or we moved on to cable and fiber and wireless. But I do want to talk about, kind of where we are today, and then how we got here and where we're going. So, most people would argue, at least by standards, we have to have some kind of benchmark for measuring where we are today. And the standard the FCC uses and has used, it's obviously debatable, but has been the speeds of 25 megabits per second down and 3 up. And that's been kind of how we've measured where the population is able to access broadband throughout our great lands. And that has been successful for determining some of the policies. It's debatable whether that should stay that way. I suspect it will be continually debated going forward. It's part of the legislation you referenced, in the investment from Congress in terms of changing the speeds. So in doing so, the question is, how do you address the issue of broadband expansion so all businesses, all consumers can take advantage of the technology? That's a really tough task, something I worked really hard at the FCC to do. How do you invest the dollars? How do you make the programs work so you can expand the networks to those that don't have it, like the Representative Andy Craig mentioned earlier? And then that requires, very constant dollars and cents in terms of actual funding, and then it also requires consistent monitoring and actions on behalf of government and the dollars that are going in to make sure that the providers that are being that are providing these subsidies are actually doing what they say. And we've had the commission the FCC has certainly improved its programs over the years to make that more efficient, to make the subsidies more efficient, to make sure that the monitoring is more efficient. If we were to take a measurement based on 25.3, the fight has always been the inaccuracy of some of the data, which bleeds into the inaccuracy of the broadband coverage maps. We obviously know that there are a number of businesses and consumers who are told that they have coverage and actually don't. And that's something that we need to correct. The commission's in the process of fixing that. But if we were to say a benchmark, the commission would say it's above 90% of America has speeds of 25.3 and has coverage today. Even if we were to double that and say that, the uncovered population is 20%, that's a huge portion of rural America that needs additional assistance. And that's where the federal government has stepped in by multiple layers. There are 2 or 3 programs that have already been created that are funding broadband, including the dollars that are already at the FCC on a yearly basis that I worked hard on. But now you have this big, massive program that is being signed as part of the president signed as part of the infrastructure investment of $42.45 billion going for access itself. And those dollars will help subsidize the build out of networks, whether they be, however the technology is to be offered. We moved away from just a pure fiber centric, and we recognize that other providers such as fixed wireless and some of the satellite providers, Starlink, and Amazon Kuiper is going to get into this business. So I'm really excited about some of the smaller providers that also offer service here. It's not just small businesses that take advantage of the technology, but it's also small businesses that offer the technology. And that's really exciting. But what it does is it provides the opportunity. Technology provides the opportunity to maximize what offering you may have in terms of a small business. It may be a service, a product, a benefit, and you can take advantage of the technology and make the level playing field if only everybody has access. So maybe I'll stop there, and hopefully that provides enough, a basis for us to have a further conversation.
Yeah, Mike, I think you hit a lot of things there that set off this conversation. I look forward to kind of circling back. You raised a really good point that I don't really think about. It's not just the small businesses that are going to be able to get online, but the small innovators who are going to bring the next breakthrough technology, and guide us into the 22nd century. We know that innovation happens not just at big companies, but oftentimes at the littlest companies that become big companies in scale. And that's what we hope to see. That's probably a good segue to John and Karen. John, maybe I'll kick it off to you first. From National Consumer League's perspective, is the promise of broadband as real as we talk about? And in your experience, what do you hear and see about from those who have access to this, but also those who don't have access? And then Karen, kind of the same question: is this as meaningful to the small business community as we think it is? So John, I'll kick it over to you.
Sure. Well, John, thanks for inviting me and NCL to contribute to the conversation today. We're really excited about that. I think, I couldn't agree more with what Congresswoman Craig said when she talked about broadband as important to consumers today as electricity and water have been. And I think that we need to make sure that all Americans have access to broadband, not just those who happen to live in areas that it is most profitable to serve. And when I think about sort of the challenge of providing rural broadband to those hardest to reach, I always think about a good colleague of mine who's a professor in Southwest Virginia. And literally, this is somebody who knows how telecom works and how broadband networks are built. And she has been trying to get broadband out to her farm in Southwest Virginia, literally for, it feels like a decade, unsuccessfully. It's always sort of not just her challenge, but what that represents in terms of all the other consumers and small business owners and entrepreneurs who are starting small businesses in rural America. They have it hard enough to reach a market as it is. And without broadband, I think that it raises those barriers even higher. Add into that if you are someone who's an entrepreneur, say of color or from historically marginalized communities, the other barriers that you face in starting a successful small business, getting access to broadband is just another hurdle that you have to get over. So I think that Congress providing billions of dollars for additional broadband build out is incredibly important, not just for rural consumers like my friend in Southwest Virginia who can't get access at home, but also for small business owners who are struggling to build a business and make ends meet. So without broadband, I think we really are holding them back and holding ourselves back as in our nation's economic development.
Hello.
Oh, we'll push pause there because we have Congressman Carter. Looks like you've joined us. Can you hear us all right, Congressman?
I can hear you fine. Are you able to hear and see me?
We can hear you. We can see you. Looks like it's a beautiful morning in front of the Capitol. This is John Stanford from Small Business Roundtable. I'll quickly say that the Honorable Troy Carter is serving his first term from Louisiana's 2nd District. It's a great looking district that encompasses some of New Orleans, but also sort of out into Baton Rouge. And Congressman, I'll kick it over to you for a few remarks about broadband and entrepreneurship and what you hope to see out of this conversation.
First of all, thank you guys very much for gathering. We greatly appreciate. We know that small businesses are the backbone of the American economy. We know how important, what an important role that you play, and we're happy in Congress to be able to deliver resources to you. As you know, the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill is one that is critically important to make sure that we have broadband, to make sure that small businesses have access to broadband. We know that many parts of our rural parts of Louisiana and America don't have fiber, so they don't have access. We also know that many parts of our community, even if they had it, couldn't afford it. But we also know that because of COVID, because of the nuances that it provides, we recognize that our world has become dependent on the ability to have distant learning, to have access to broadband. We know that small businesses require it because it's the new normal. So we're very excited that in this $1.2 trillion infrastructure package, that we have resources that will make broadband available worldwide, throughout our country, I should say. And that's critically important as we talk about what you mean to us, small businesses. Small businesses providing resources in the way of collecting and raising revenue, sales taxes, which is the fuel for local government, what gives us the opportunity to hire police and to pay roads and to pay for police and fire and other resources. So hats off to you, small business community, for the incredible work that you do, not only in providing goods and services to the people of America, but also providing jobs, providing resources so our government can be fueled. And we feel a sense of responsibility to you to continue to make ways and create opportunities that are better for you, whether it's broadband or streamlining processes that will allow you to be able to access your goods. We know that the demand has been very difficult after COVID. We know that getting resources and getting employees and getting manufacturers up and going is very, very, very challenging for you. We're here for you, and you should know that government is here to work for you. We stand firmly with you as a member of the Small Business Committee. It's something that we talk about all the time. Know that you have friends. Chairman Velasquez with the Small Business Committee, who is the chair. I'm very pleased to serve on the committee. We understand and we appreciate the hard work, the great things that you do for America, and know that you've got a partner in us. God bless you. Thank you for all the great work that you do. Continue providing resources, and we will continue partnering on our side with United States Congress to be that partner that helps you continue to help us.
Well, thank you again, as always, Congressman. It is nice to see you. Thank you for those words. And thank you, more importantly, to the good work you and your committee members have done on behalf of small businesses and on behalf of infrastructure. And we're grateful for you and your team for joining today.
God bless you. Thank you. Keep up the great work.
Take care, Congressman. Karen, the congressman said, a lot of interesting things there that I know you would agree with about the importance of broadband to small business. And this is an issue you've worked on for quite a while. What are some of your reflections about how important getting quality internet is to the small business community?
Well, thank you, John. Thank you for hosting this important conversation today. And a big shout out of gratefulness also to Congressman Carter and the work that he does for the House Small Business Committee. And then, of course, thank you, Mike O'Reilly, for your work at the FCC during your tenure. Just so many things that you worked on that have been vital, I think, to access to broadband, and particularly focusing on sort of the next technology and sort of 5G rollout and the streamlining of rules and regulations, the Rural Development Opportunity Fund, and always being sensitive to the fact that small businesses have a big role to play also in the build out and the rollout and deployment of broadband. 83% of telecommunications companies that do work in this whole sector have under 20 employees. So there's a lot of small businesses working alongside the big guys in deploying broadband and doing all the innovative things that small businesses and entrepreneurs count on. Gosh, John, there's so much to reflect on, and I'll just say this. I mean, the pandemic, I think, well, even before the pandemic, technology, access to broadband really is and has been a critical tool for small businesses in terms of being able to compete, to innovate, and basically to grow their businesses. And the pandemic really drove home that point that, access to broadband is not just a tool, it's not just a luxury, it really is a necessity. It's part of the nation's infrastructure. And we were very happy to see the infrastructure package have this provision, a pretty sizable provision for broadband access. Look at all the surveys that we did during the course of COVID-19 demonstrated how powerful broadband was and is to these small businesses. 80%, of the small businesses that we surveyed said that they wouldn't have been able to survive the pandemic, without access to the online tools, the platforms, cloud services, all those things made possible, through broadband. And obviously there's been a big pivot, in our economy, this big transformation to a digital economy, the acceleration of the digital economy. And that's driving a tremendous amount of new business creation and entrepreneurship in this country. Business applications are up 56%, 4.5 million new business applications alone this year from January to October, which far exceeds new business applications even before the pandemic. So, people are seeing opportunity in the marketplace. They're seeing a new way of doing things, and truly it is broadband and technology that's making all this possible. And but again, everyone has to have access to this opportunity, and that's why access to broadband really has been a pillar of our policy agenda over the past 10 years or more, and to rural areas and underserved areas, because for everyone to have, to be able to have access to the digital economy, all its tools and this new opportunity, they have to have access to broadband. So our hope, I guess, in this package and in moving forward, and we could discuss these in details later, is that, the package does get implemented quickly. We're happy to see that the White House did appoint a infrastructure czar, for lack of a better term, because, this will make a big difference for small businesses and for those communities that don't have broadband. If it doesn't get caught up in a lot of red tape and bureaucracy and take a lot of time. So this is vitally important. And I think the focus on the next generation of technologies, 5G, is equally important as well. And we can't keep our eye off of that ball, particularly given, where the promise that has for small businesses and where our international competitors are on that front.
Well, Karen, I think I appreciated those statistics. I mean, stunning new business growth driven by that adoption of technology. And therefore, I mean, we had a question come in about impacts for people of color. And I know if Connie were here, this is something AEO has spent some time working on, is that disparate impact. And it's kind of, this advent of digital is only going to widen the gap if we don't solve this as fast as possible. So I think your point about, look, it's great that we pass this legislation, but if implementation takes a decade, that's a decade of underserved communities being, left behind. So Mike, I want to pivot to you as someone, we have one question in, and I encourage everyone, please keep your questions coming in through the Q&A. We'll throw some of them in live. We'll save some of them for the end. We had a question come in about that 25-3. Mike, can you talk a little bit about what is 25-3 in terms of a speed for broadband? Who sets that? I know the FCC has played a role historically, and then I'll do the impossible and ask you a second question. So one, if you can speak to 25-3, that'd be helpful. But two, Karen talked a lot about implementation. What will the FCC's role look like in implementing or building on sort of broadband, not just in the bill, but more broadly? So I'll kick it over to Mike.
So 25-3, I'll start with your first part. 25-3, I referenced it a little bit in my opening comments. It's 25 megabits per second down, 3 megabits per second up. Download speeds obviously are more important. And if you look at any user study, you'll realize that downloads are 10 times more data than uploads. There have been calls for symmetrical speeds over the time in last, certainly in the last year, people talked about symmetrical speeds, but that doesn't match up with user preferences and how much they actually, for small businesses, it does change. It may be more 50-50 in terms of how much they're sending, upwards compared to downloading. So that does matter, and it's trying to figure out how do you get to better speeds. The legislation that's now law talks about 120. So it's trying to cover those areas who don't have 25-3, but make sure that we're building for the future. And we did that at the FCC in a number of efforts in terms of, the Karen referenced the RDOF program. We invested heavily in trying to advance the ball in terms of advanced technology and in advanced broadband speeds for consumers, making sure where the dollars went. So we weren't investing in things like DSL or dial-up and things like that. We've moved on. And the question is, who, you referenced who sets that? Well, the commission sets it for its own purposes. It doesn't set it for the nation. It doesn't declare it, here is our standard. It declares it for its purposes, and it has some internal reasons why it does certain things, some certain policy, the directives that come from it. Certainly in terms of, what steps it's going to take to expand the system, to expand the investment nationwide. And the second part of your question gets to, where are we going, and how are these dollars going to be invested, and what is the existing, the FCC will continue to invest its, give or take, about $5 billion in high cost per year, in perpetuity, and it spends about $9 billion overall, $9 to $10 billion overall on what can be captured as universal service, which feeds things like Lifeline and rural, and telehealth, and the high costs that I mentioned. So really important programs that are all wrapped up into that. But you have all of this money going into the system. And it was referenced earlier by some of the panelists, how are we going to make sure these dollars are implemented? That's the tough work. That's the heavy lifting going forward. And much of the new law shifts that authority to the NTIA. The FCC has been the driving force given that amount of dollars that it's had over the years compared to other agencies. Well, this shifts those responsibilities in a big way to NTIA at the Department of Commerce. The FCC still has a responsibility because all the dollars are tied to what I referenced in my opening statement, the maps, and the data for where the areas who are unserved today, who doesn't have access today. Those maps are being worked on. The commission's work will then be the basis for how the grants are given by NTA through the different states that are applying. So you have a really shift of responsibility, and we're going to have to see how the different agencies work well together going forward.
I think a couple good takeaways there. I really appreciated that you calling out that change, and I think for many of our congressional staff who've joined us today, that elevation of NTIA for the role here, I think, is an important from an oversight and implementation role. And you made a good point in your opening statement. And I think that this is only going to be as good as the maps we have, and that understanding where those gaps are is critically important. I know that's something, John and Karen's groups will focus on, is giving voice to folks who if the map is wrong, getting it addressed so that they can say, hey, you're moving on without me. John, something else we've talked about is, the subsidies and, for providers. Can you talk a little bit about how consumers will be impacted by all of this? We've looked at the small business side, but what kind of consumer impacts are you expecting? And can you talk about the role of subsidies a little bit in all of this?
Sure. So I think it's important to understand that broadband and our nation's broadband networks are in many ways beholden to the same economic effects that other networks in the past. I'm thinking of the telephone network, or in particular. And the network effect there is that as more people get connected to that network, the network itself becomes more valuable. And obviously, I think this definitely applies to broadband. So when we make broadband or access to broadband unaffordable for consumers, whether they live in areas that are already well served or in places that are unserved or underserved, we are making the entire network less valuable. So I think it makes a lot of sense for, as a public policy, to provide subsidies to consumers to help them afford broadband. Certainly, I think we're happy to have seen sort of additional money being put into sort of the successor to the emergency broadband benefit. NCL, we've consistently been defenders of the Lifeline program. And we have defended those programs and endorsed these subsidies for precisely the reason I just discussed. By allowing everyone to have access, we are benefiting the network as a whole. And so I think it's really incumbent that we continue to think about how subsidies can make access more affordable, particularly as we start to move towards new technologies like satellite or 5G that may have been out of reach for consumers because of cost reasons. And so if we can make those technologies more accessible to folks who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford them, then I think we also decrease the digital divide that I think was discussed earlier, which really has incredible benefits, not just for entrepreneurs, but for students. I think, Karen talked about earlier, we can't wait 10 years to roll out for the investments we're making today to actually show fruit. I have a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old daughter, sorry, a 14 and 17-year-old daughter at home. And 10 years from now, the chance to make an investment in their education through broadband is not going to be as impactful as it would be today. Fortunately, I live in an area that's well served, but I definitely think of the consumers and their families in areas that aren't well served, who can't really afford to wait 10 years for their sons and daughters to have access to the kind of broadband they need to get an effective education.
Well, I think we have seen just an increased rate. This cuts across so many things. It's small business, it's education, it's the basic consumer experience. We've highlighted that, if you are in a place that is underserved, you are, for internet, you are therefore underserved in so many ways. You touched on a few pieces there that I want to make sure everyone highlights. We have an issue of broadband availability, but I think affordability is just as much, if it's available and you can't afford it, then it really isn't available. So I thought that was a really good point, John. I want to talk a little bit about some of the words folks have used about public-private partnerships. I think, the government has clearly passed major legislation here. Mike, maybe I'll go to you first, and then Karen to talk about what's the private sector's role in this. My understanding as a layman is that just because the government wishes something to be so, we really are going to need some public-private partnerships. Mike, could you touch on just how important that is? And also, you referenced earlier some of the real innovation in this space. We've talked about satellite. You mentioned Project Kuiper. Can you talk a little bit about those and what you're seeing in the private sector in terms of innovation?
So absolutely, the private sector is going to have to lead. It has provided a great deal of broadband access to Americans today. Those that have it enjoy the services, and they've been incredibly valuable during the pandemic. So they should be applauded for all the work that they've done to make the networks the most resistant, most responsible, and most robust in the world. Now the question is, how do you get it to everybody? How do you get it to the last 5, 10, 15%, depending on your measurement? And then that's the heavy challenge, and that's where the commission in its past, and that's where Congress in its terms of decision is investing in the private sector. It's putting its dollars, say the market itself, the free market is deciding, that it's maybe not be, and return on investment may not be as strong in certain areas, certain rural markets may not be profitable, but we're going to put federal dollars in one form or another behind the private sector and give you the money to expand your network out into the areas that don't have service today. And in doing so, we expand the size of our individual private networks. We'll have new networks that will establish. There'll be smaller companies that will take advantage of these dollars and try and compete to fight for the dollars in these areas and make their mark on the world and bring service forward. So that's really important that ties together how everything will fit. As we expand these programs going forward. How do you get to there? And John referenced the affordability issue, and it's addressed in the legislation. It is $14 billion is going to go for some component, different programs, but some component of affordability. It tends to be more in the areas where you have a number of providers, but the economics of the area don't allow, don't have consumers able to afford the service itself. Those are both, I think, the yin and yang of broadband policy today. And the commission has worked on that in the past, and the Congress is acknowledging that as well. And it did not just in this legislation, but in past legislation at addressing the pandemic. So those two things are really important, working really hard to expand service so every American has opportunity to connect. And that makes the availability of those networks robust enough so small businesses can offer their services to everybody who's connected.
Karen, you've had a career bridging the gap between America's 30 million small businesses and the federal government and at times the state government. What needs to be done? What does the right partnership look like to bridge the gap between what is now going to be NTIA, FCC, the administration, and small businesses, so this happens as fast as possible and all technologies get to be pulled forward?
Well, I think broadly speaking, John, that there does need to be an enabling environment for investment. And we know that billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of private sector investment went into these broadband networks. And again, I agree and will echo the comments of Mike. regarding the kudos that go out, to our networks and the phenomenal job they did during the pandemic, in order to, again, have this, really lack of problems, in accessing broadband and the networks, given the extraordinary demand, that was placed on our networks. They really, were the marvel of the world. And so, this, to me, yes, public and private, they have to collaborate. But from a policy perspective, we do have to understand, or our government officials and Congress has to understand, that there needs to be an enabling environment for private sector investment. For example, my understanding, in order to build out, our nation's 5G network, you're going to need a minimum of $250 billion, to do that or more. I mean, that's a lot of money, and the government can't cough up that money. It's got to come from the private sector as well. So I think, just being cognizant again of the environment, and that we do need to encourage investment, which then leads to more innovation, is very critical, particularly in the deployment, of 5G, not only at the federal level in terms of, what the federal level can do in setting standards and encouraging, state and localities to streamline permitting and reviews and things like that to make 5G available, in their localities, but also state and local governments. I mean, this is a competitive issue, and this is an access issue, for their residents. And also, I will add this: there's got to be communication and collaboration in government to government. NTIA, am I saying that right? The NTIA, right? NTIA and the FCC. And now, I mean, we're looking at a little, I guess I call it a dispute between the FAA and the FCC, because, AT&T and Verizon were set to roll out a new 5G frequency band this month. And then the FAA, issued a warning, a warning to pilots and airlines about potential interference. And this is something that, this issue we thought was already dealt with, and that, the FCC did due diligence. They were the experts on this issue. So these are the types of uncertainties and surprises that, the private sector doesn't need. And so, the FAA and the FCC, I think, they have to sort of come to an agreement right away, about this interference issue, or get over this, so that we can, again, roll out the next new technologies, 5G, which is going to lead to more businesses, more innovation, more opportunities. And again, that's so critical for continued entrepreneurship and opportunity, but also for our nation's competitiveness.
Well, you referenced the FAA, FCC sort of debacle, I think is the only word to call it. And I think that's a really good example of where, government has to be very cautious about how it, how it can be a barrier itself. You also mentioned that $250 billion, and we do know that, yes, there are a tremendous amount of resources being dedicated, but it's scratched by the government in IIJA, but it's only scratching the surface. And I hope that's a big takeaway for everyone listening today, is to seriously have this internet infrastructure for the 21st and 22nd century. It's the private sector that's going to make the majority of the investment. Mike, I see you nodding. I wonder, could you just reaffirm sort of how much, when you were in the FCC, how much of the expectation of solving these societal crises as it relates to access to the internet is falling on government, and how much is going to have to fall on the private sector?
Well, a heavy portion is going to have to fall on the private sector. And you think about the investments, and I didn't answer your previous question, because talk about some of the new technologies and the new investments being made by the private sector. We have fixed wireless services that are being deployed. So you're talking about a wireless connection of a gigabit speed down, a really impressive investments being made. You talk about satellite networks being, Starlink and Amazon Kuiper coming on board in coming years. Really exciting stuff, because we're going to need new technologies to address those areas that are geographically, we're not going to be able to drag fiber to everyone's home. It's just not going to be in the cards. And then we really get to the issue of, the government has to be mindful of what is it doing in the space? What actions can it do to improve? And you have fights like that Karen mentioned over spectrum bands and the deployment of new opportunities and 5G networks and what we're going to see from them. That's a real impediment to move forward. And the FAA, and I've used the word fiasco in terms of how we've approached this, and it's shameful that we're in this situation. I appreciate that the industry was willing and able to come to an agreement for the short term, but I'd like to see that resolved long term, where the networks can be deployed throughout the nation and we can have 5G ubiquitous service as soon as possible. You mentioned earlier, how do we get speeds? How do we get, and it's not just the speeds of the network, but how do we get deployment speeds? And that's going to be a tough question. That, we don't want it to be 10 years that John talked about, in terms of his kids, and investments being made for students. How do you shorten that window, but also make sure those dollars go, as far as they possibly can? Because it's really, $65 billion is 10 years worth of FCC funding, but it's going to pale in comparison to the amount of money that the private sector makes in this space. You have the cable networks moving to 10G, and that's not 10G wireless, that's 10 gigabits per second. That's a huge pipe that's coming to consumers' home, and that covers a great portion of the United States, and the private sector being invested there. So really exciting things are on the horizon and are being invested in today. The question is, what can government do? And Karen referenced this a little bit earlier. It's removing those barriers to deployment, whether it be permitting or the approval process or the trenching that's needed to happen. All those things are really important to make the networks expand, to allow the private sector to build out to everyone who needs access going forward. So really heavy lifting to be done going forward, and as we shift responsibilities to NTIA, we really hope that process works smoothly.
Well, from the tech geek side of me, I've got to say some of the projects that are coming out, you make the great point that fiber can't reach every household in the United States. And some of the market-based solutions about doing this, whether it's satellite, whether it's fixed wireless, I think are really compelling and almost sci-fi quality stuff. I mean, we're going to really be living through this over the next decade. I want to open it up. We've already had a stream of questions coming in, so we'll pivot to those. But if you have another question, by all means, please use the Q&A function as we head towards the top of the hour here. We'll try to use every last minute. One of the questions was about one of the programs that Karen, I think you mentioned, but Mike, you would also have familiarity with, and that's the Rural Opportunity Fund at FCC. Mike, can you talk a little bit about what that is? I know we mentioned it in passing.
Yes, the RDOF is an investment that the FCC made to bring high-speed service to consumers who didn't have it. We knew we used the maps that were already in existence. We knew that there were areas that absolutely were agreed no service was being provided. And how do we bring a provider? How do we invest dollars to the private sector to build out to those areas? And made an investment about $9 billion to bring high-speed networks of all types. It was made sure that I worked really hard to make sure it was technology neutral, that it wasn't going to be one service over the other. So some of them are going to be, fixed wireless. Some of them are going to be, fiber-based. Some of them are going to be, there's satellite in that space. And so we're going to get service to these areas that have absolutely nothing. So I worked really hard to make sure that we expanded that program, and I'm really excited on where it's going to go. The commission's in the process of approving applications, reviewing the long forms, which is a technical term, but it's to make sure the dollars can flow to those companies and they can build in the short term, or in some regards it's the medium term. How do you get that dollars crunched down so they can build in the 1 to 2 to 3 years versus the later 6-year kind of time frame.
I think that's helpful, Mike. Another question came in on in the debate for the infrastructure package. There's been a lot of talk about minority and underserved communities. I'll open this to the whole panel. I think we've covered that a lot of the places that have been left behind are either LMI communities or majority minority communities. What does this mean from your perspective to entrepreneurs of color that we do this and do it in a quick way? Any thoughts that you all have there? And Karen or John, maybe I'd kick it to you first.
Sure. So happy to take that one. Entrepreneurs of color face so many barriers in our country, access to capital being sort of just the first that comes to mind, that are based in many ways in systemic issues that I think go far beyond simply access to broadband. But access to affordable broadband is incredibly needed for those entrepreneurs to get to market. I think of the small business person who in the past, in order to open up a shop, may have needed to get funding from the bank to sign a lease with a landlord in an area that may or may not be welcoming to her and to her customers. With access to broadband, she has the ability to reach, frankly, an unlimited number of customers that really gets around some of those barriers. So I think making sure that entrepreneurs and small business people of color, particularly in underserved areas, get the same kind of access that folks in more affluent areas, to be honest with you, have, is absolutely critical to addressing not just the digital divide, but to starting to chip away at some of the systemic barriers that I think our country faces.
Mm-hmm. Those are all great points made by John. And, there are entrepreneurs everywhere. And in, rural America and an urban area. And unfortunately, many of these individuals don't have access, to the tools, of the 21st century, the digital economy, that so many others are seeing right now, and why you see this surge in entrepreneurship. Now, I will note that in this big boom in entrepreneurship, there's been a 27% increase among women entrepreneurs, according to the Census Bureau data. We're not quite sure, where this entrepreneurship is taking place. I'm sure it falls along lines of, high density and population, where the population is right now. But, John is absolutely right. These barriers, to entrepreneurship, access to capital, access to markets, access to technical tools and training, can all be decimated if individuals have access to broadband. Because, if you look at now, all, where small businesses are accessing markets, accessing capital, it's all because they have the tools, technology tools and access to broadband and all the types of platforms that are making, that access seamless and easy, and more affordable. So, that's why I really will be there working alongside you, John, I'm sure, John, and perhaps Mike. I hope so, to make sure that, there is that the need for speed not only applies for broadband, but also to this, broadband investment provision within the infrastructure package.
Yeah, I think you put that well, that there is a need for speed, pun intended, that we've got to roll this out fast. We only look back to Karen and I certainly spent a lot of time in the trenches over the last year with the Paycheck Protection Program. One of the challenges and one of the success stories coming out of that were, yes, we had traditional lending institutions, but there was also a role played by fintech to expedite getting some of these loans out to folks who didn't have traditional banking. But again, that premise is entirely dictated upon the ability to log into one of those fintechs. And yeah, go ahead, Karen.
And I, and to add to that, in terms of access to capital, as you know, John, we work very much on the equity and debt-based crowdfunding, initiative. $1 billion has been raised on these regulated platforms now. Only one case of fraud. So, but we always said that this would democratize access to capital, and it has. A large portion of the people raising money, entrepreneurs and startups on those platforms, are communities of color, women, minority entrepreneurs. I mean, this truly has democratized access to capital and to investors. But again, all communities need to have access to broadband, in order to tap into these platforms.
Yeah, I think and Karen is the godmother of that crowdfunding, I mean, everything you did with the Jobs Act, but that rarely do we talk about silver bullets in policy, because there's rarely one thing that can lift all boats. This is a silver bullet. And I hope folks who are in positions of policymaking to help expedite the implementation of IIJA as it relates to broadband, this is what you've got to be doing. You want to do something meaningful for unconnected small businesses and entrepreneurs and would-be entrepreneurs. We've got time for one more question. It's an interesting one. Investments in broadband operated by cities. And so, Mike, I'm gonna maybe kick this one to you to see if you have thoughts. In Colorado, for example, some cities operate fiber-based internet. This has provided a better experience and is affordable, and it's easier to pay one utility bill for some communities. Mike, do you see that as a role moving forward for that, or is the investment maybe too large for cities to make?
Well, look, I've been, it's a mixed to negative to having cities build broadband networks. They have a past track record of not very success, and that lends me to worry about it is a very more complicated business to offer broadband than it is to offer water or electricity or other services. And in those, we've seen in Colorado, and it gets to some of the points that Karen raised. There have been pushes to have city networks, and at the same time to prevent the deployment from private sector networks, to slow down their building permits, to slow down their investments on wireless or on fiber trenches to be or aerial networks in order to favor these city networks. And what you have is you get a city network that then people who are not familiar with broadband, and then trying to figure out how do you modernize that network? How do you invest in it going forward? And you crowd out the private sector. You crowd out the innovation that happens throughout America. So I worry that we're going to spend a lot of money, building these citywide networks. And you also raise the issue, who are we trying to target these dollars to? And it's primarily Congress has said we need to get everybody connected. And those, the city net is where most people are already connected. We have new programs on affordability for those purposes, and John and I talked about those as well. And so that's the best way to get to it, rather than building a new network or trying to offer. In terms of the one bill, sure, it's easier for small businesses to have one bill. Great, I get that, but it can't be the reason we do public policy is whether you have to have two stamps or one stamp.
I think that is a great place to leave it at the top of the hour. It will take private sector solutions. I just don't think there can be any doubt to that. A lot of great takeaways. This entire recording will be made available at Small Business Roundtable. A special thank to Representatives Craig and Carter, Karen, John, and Mike. Fabulous as always. I think we'll have multiple conversations moving forward on this. So thank you everyone for joining. And let's all get that broadband deployed as fast as possible. Thanks, everyone.